Welcome to the Healthy AF podcast. This episode is all about seed oils and their negative impact on our health. Now let's get into it. Seed oils, also known as vegetable oils, the top ones to watch out for are soy, safflower, sunflower, corn, cottonseed, canola, grapeseed, and rice bran oils. These are the most common found in processed foods and used in nearly every restaurant you're going to walk into. There are others to avoid as well, but those that I just listed are known as the hateful eight, a name coined by Dr. Kate Shanahan, who's one of the first to really sound the alarm on the negative impact of these oils. Now, these are all polyunsaturated fats. Yes, the very fats we have been told to use and to replace the saturated fat in our diet. They have a very high concentration of an omega-6 fatty acid called linoleic acid. Now, this is important. I'm going to get a little sciencey on you, but it's to help you understand, one, why they're bad, the negative impact of them, and two, so if you encounter another oil that I didn't just list, you know what to look for to determine whether it's right for you. Okay. So linoleic acid is the primary omega-6 fatty acid in all of our food, whether it's a whole food like a nut or even whatever polyunsaturated fat might be in a meat, or in the processed food like some pink packaged thing that will be on a grocery store shelf. The omega-6 fatty acids in those foods is going to be linoleic acid, and it only comes from our diet. Remember that. Now, you've probably heard of omega-3 fats. They're prevalent in fish. They're anti-inflammatory. We're told to take those to reduce inflammation and to try to balance out our omega-6 intake with some omega-3 intake, right? So we have a balance between inflammation and anti-inflammatory oils or fats, But these omega-6 fats that are inflammatory actually in small amounts have a role in our diet. So we need a certain small amount of them for certain processes, for certain inflammatory processes. We don't have to get into that, but just know a small amount is normal. Large amounts in our diet and in our bodies appear to be very problematic, which I'll explain what those issues are in just a bit, based on several studies looking at the effects of linoleic acid in our bodies. One study, however, that was measuring the percentage of linoleic acid that's being stored in our body fat, started looking at the stored linoleic acid in U.S. citizens' adipose tissue starting in 1959. So in 1959, we had about 9%, on average, 9% of our body fat was linoleic acid. Over the course of about 50 years to 2008, that amount had increased to 22%. 22% of our body fat was now linoleic acid. In 50 years, an increase from 9% to 22%. That is significant. And again, this can only come from our diet. We can't make this fat endogenously, right? We make saturated fat and monounsaturated fat in our bodies for storage. That's how we store fat, as saturated or monounsaturated. And we compile fats in a way, that's a simple way of saying it, but we basically take the excess fat and we store it as saturated or monounsaturated in our bodies. We cannot make omega-3s or omega-6 polyunsaturated fats. We have to take them in our diet. So this increase in omega-6 fatty acids in our body fat has to be coming from our diet. Now, these oils have tremendous concentrations of linoleic acid compared to the traditional fats we've been using for thousands of years, right? Now, and I'll compare those in just a second. But we also need to understand that these oils are very new to our food system, starting about 1911 with Crisco, which is made of cottonseed oil, hit the market. And prior to that, say 1900, when we look at metabolic disease symptoms, obesity rate was maybe 1%. Heart disease was almost unheard of. Type 2 diabetes really hadn't even been recognized because it just wasn't occurring enough for anyone to know that it existed. Type 1 diabetes was certainly a problem, but that's a very, very different disease. That's an autoimmune disease and not so directly diet driven. So we really didn't have metabolic disease on any significant level prior to the 1900s. So obviously something has changed because now obesity is 42% as of 2018. It's headed to 50% by 2030. Heart disease is the number one killer of humans. Type 2 diabetes numbers are growing. The official number for type 2 diabetes is, they say 11 or 12% is probably more for people who are undiagnosed. The numbers for pre-diabetes, in other words, people who are insulin resistant and tracking towards getting diabetes, if they continue the track they're on, is close to 38% of the US population. So between 10%, 12% diagnosed, 38% pre-diabetic, we're looking at close to 50% of our population being pre-diabetic or diabetic, which makes sense when you have 50%, we're tracking towards 50% obesity. So it's not that hard to imagine. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which used to be fairly rare. So fatty liver that isn't driven by alcoholism, right? It is now becoming, or will be soon, the primary cause of liver transplants. That wasn't the case 20 years ago. It was much more rare. And now it's going to be the primary driver behind liver transplants. Now, I've included a chart with some additional info in the show notes showing the concentrations of linoleic acid in these oils as compared to some traditional fats. But I'll just go over them very quickly just to get an idea of what we're talking about here. So canola, we've all heard of canola. It's the most common one, the one they tell us to eat probably more often than anything else, right? To use. And it's actually, it's of all those 8, it has the lowest concentration of linoleic acid at about 20%. Sunflower oil has about 70% linoleic acid. Traditional safflower oil is about 75% linoleic acid, but there's a modified high oleic safflower, which you might read on some ingredients, especially some of the healthier ones. That's only about 14% linoleic acid. Now, I would still avoid it if it's in any kind of large concentration. Avoid it when you can, because it's a modified, they've taken this modified seed, which has a little more monounsaturated fat in it. So it's reduced the amount of the linoleic acid to 14% compared to 75, which would be naturally. You make your own judgment on that one. Corn oil, about 57% linoleic acid. Soy and cottonseed, 54%. Grapeseed, 70% linoleic acid. Rice bran oil is about 30% linoleic acid. Now, if we compare those to tallow and butter, there are 2 to 3% linoleic acid, right? That's a little more in keeping of one where we want it in our body fat. If we had even from 3 to 6% of our body fat being linoleic acid, we probably would have all the issues that we have with metabolic disease, because that's pretty much where we were back in the 1800s before we had metabolic disease, right? Because it came into our diet in such small amounts in whole food, like in tallow, butter, 2 to 3%, maybe in a nut, on the rare occasion that we ate nuts, or the rare season that we had nuts in our diet before then. Lard and olive oil are about 9% linoleic acid. So a little higher than tallow and butter, but still in the single digits, and much lower than these oils I just mentioned. Coconut oil, another great one, is about 2% linoleic acid. Avocado is closer to 12%. The avocado oil specifically is about 12% linoleic acid. The problem, though, with olive oil, because that's not such a big number, is it? Or avocado oil, is that there's evidence showing that many of the avocado oils on the market have been diluted with some of these cheaper oils, like the ones I just mentioned, like soybean or safflower. So that is going to raise the amount of linoleic acid in these bottles labeled avocado oil. Now, there's a few of them, of course, are pure avocado oil, but you have to really do your research and find out what those are, because otherwise you're just feeding more linoleic acid in your body thinking, hey, I'm doing great. This is only 12%, 14%, when really it may be set closer to 20, 30, 40%, depending on the dilution. Now, those are the most common, but if you want to know the linoleic acid concentration of a particular oil, just search it. Just search, linoleic acid concentration of X fat, whatever it is, and then determine your risk. Obviously, the less, the better, as I pointed out here. But as we look at correlate the increase in obesity and type 2 diabetes in the 1900s with the increase of these oils in our food system, we can see some pretty close ties in timing. So Dr. Kate Shanahan has really captured this in two different charts. I put these in the show notes so you can check them out. The first is the correlation with obesity, which again was low, single digits, early 1900s. And then we see it really take off in 1920. Again, Crisco hit the market in 1912, 1911, 1912. And then we saw an increase in corn oils and other oils hitting the market. So in 1920, we see obesity really take off. And it really parallels its rise on the chart, really parallels with the increase of these oils in our food system. Meanwhile, lard and butter, which are also charted there, really hold steady for several decades and then start to decrease as we get into the 70s and 80s. People start using less lard and butter. Carbs really don't move much. They fluctuate a bit, but they pretty much stay in the same range. The only food item that's tracked here that seems to be really tracking strongly with the increase in obesity are these seed oils. And the next one is, she has in there is from type 2 diabetes. Same correlation. Really, the first noted case of type 2 diabetes was actually 1938, and they didn't start tracking the statistics until 1958. So the chart looks a little different in that type 2 diabetes doesn't really start tracking and ramping upward until after 1958 when they started tracking this stuff. But you'll again see it catches right up and starts paralleling the increase in usage of seed oils. Meanwhile, butter, lard, carbs all holding steady, or with butter and lard declining as we got into the 70s and 80s. So yes, correlation doesn't prove cause, right? So just because the increase in usage of the oils happens to correlate with the increase in type 2 diabetes, obesity, there's another one for heart disease, just the same thing. Let's reverse engineer this a little bit. We've been told that saturated fat is a driver of these diseases of obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, right? But if there's no correlation, as in both don't increase statistically together, right? Why would you blame saturated fats like butter or lard when we've been using those all over the world for thousands of years without seeing signs of these diseases? And their appearance and increase in our culture, especially in the US, has really only appeared and grown, right, since the introduction of these oils. So logically speaking, if you have a correlation with these oils, no correlation with saturated fats, wouldn't you take a closer look at the new additive to the food system that correlates positively with the new increase in disease? Right. Rather than trying to blame the ones we've been using traditionally for thousands of years all over the world without signs of these metabolic diseases. So again, those charts are in the show notes. But real quick, I want to go over just a few briefly, go over the titles and maybe a summary on one or two of them, of 5 studies, just 5. I have 50, to be honest, which I'll be listing in my resources in the Healthy AF Club, but 5 just for this episode that point to a correlation between linoleic acid and actual diseases. So these are peer-reviewed, published studies. Let's start with, here we go, dietary linoleic acid. So linoleic acid in the diet. Elevate, basically it's called endogenous 2-AG and anandamide. Nice word, huh? And induces obesity. So I have to know, those two, the 2-AG and the anandamide, are just byproducts of metabolizing linoleic acid. So that's what happened as a result of these kind of molecules, right? Basically, you just, dietary linoleic acid elevated obesity. So second one, consumption of a high fat diet rich in omega-6 polyunsaturated fat. So again, that's just another term for linoleic acid because that's the only omega-6 PUFA in our diet. So high fat diet rich in omega-6 PUFA for only 4 weeks instigates mitochondrial damage and causes cardiac dysfunction. So mitochondrial damage to the mitochondria, which is our energy system. That's where carbs and fat come into our cell pumped into the mitochondria inside the cell. And that mitochondria then turns those macronutrients into cellular energy, to ATP. So we're causing damage to those mitochondria, which create our energy, and cardiac dysfunction. So I've been accusing saturated fat of. You see, we've been pointing the finger at the wrong fat. 4-HNE, which is another byproduct, it's a byproduct of linoleic acid, directly correlates with obesity, growth of visceral fat, and insulin resistance. Okay, so here we go. Number 4 here, linoleic acid can cause endothelial dysfunction. More linoleic acid is seen in the LDL of people with type 2 diabetes. So endothelial dysfunction. Endothelia is the lining of your arteries. So linoleic acid can cause dysfunction in the lining of your arteries. More linoleic acid is seen in the LDL of people with type 2 diabetes. So type 2 diabetics are known, type 2 diabetes and heart disease are like sisters, right? You have one, you have type 2 diabetes, you're going to get heart disease because the symptoms are so overlapping and the effects of one create the other. So heart disease, type 2 diabetes, they're joined at the hip. And they're seeing more linoleic acid in the LDL, LDL being the carrier, right? It's like a delivery truck of cholesterol, of triglycerides, which are fats, and vitamins A, D, and E. So they're seeing this linoleic acid in the delivery trucks of the cholesterol and so forth with people with type 2 diabetes. And guess where they're finding that? In the plaques. In the plaques in their arteries, causing endothelial dysfunction. The role, last study, the role of dietary cholesterol and oxidized fatty acids in the development of atherosclerosis. Here again, we're getting to linoleic acid's connection to heart disease. So this omega-6, this PUFA, polyunsaturated fat, we're supposed to be, substituting our saturated fat with, is actually driving the atherosclerosis that we're accusing the saturated fat of. Now, dietary oxidized cholesterol and oxidized fatty acids, what I was just talking about in the previous study, where the LDL carries cholesterol and other fatty acids, triglycerides. And these PUFAs, these polyunsaturated fats, are much more prone to oxidation than monounsaturated or saturated fat because of their molecular structure. They have open spots. Basically, keep it simple. Saturated fat and monounsaturated fat are more resistant to oxidation because all of the molecule is pretty much closed. It's a tight molecule. Polyunsaturated fat has open spots where oxygen atoms can attach themselves and cause that fat, that lipid, to oxidize. That's bad. That's like rust. When metal oxidizes, it turns to rust. So we're talking about rust for fat. And when it gets into your system, it creates more inflammation and oxidation in your tissues. It's very bad. We see the oxidized cholesterol and oxidized fatty acids in plaques. We don't see healthy cholesterol and a lot of healthy cholesterol in plaques. They see the oxidized stuff. And so this is basically saying the linoleic acid, because it's a PUFA, become easily oxidized, being transported by the LDL is what we're seeing. And when that LDL is transferring or carrying oxidized fats and oxidized cholesterol, it basically oxidizes the whole cargo, if you will, the lipid cargo. And so that's what gets deposited and causes the problems and the inflammation in the artery, which then stimulates our immune system to react. We start creating foam cells and creating plaque. And that's why these oxidized cholesterol particles and fatty acid particles are found in the plaques. That's the saying, in the development of atherosclerosis. They're the ones being found in the plaques, not so much the saturated fat, which has been demonized since the 50s, if we really look back. So if you're looking for articles like this, these research articles on polyunsaturated fat, when we start looking at polyunsaturated fat, they're going to look very positive because that's the established narrative. And so when they start writing these articles, polyunsaturated fat's good for you. It's positive to, replacing saturated fat with, all that narrative, right? That's what they're trying to tell you. But when you start searching specifically for studies on linoleic acid, which is a polyunsaturated fat, it's a primary one in our diet. Remember, we can't get much omega-3. They want us to replace or eat as much omega-3 with supplements, right? And fish to offset all of the omega-6, the inflammatory oil, which is telling you there's an abundance of omega-6 in our diet intrinsically. There's so much of it. There's no way we could out supplement the omega-6 with omega-3s. There's no way we can eat enough omega-3 fatty acids to balance out the omega-6 we have coming to our bodies from our diet. It's impossible. What we need to do is reduce the omega-6. Remember, it has increased to the point that the percentage in our body fat has increased from, in the last 50 years, up to 2008, from 9% to 22%. Well, here we are, as I record this, 15 years after that, from 2008 to 2023, it's probably gone up past that. Wouldn't you imagine the way we eat, all the processed food, all the restaurant food, everything being delivered that's pre-made, processed, cooked in restaurants? Yeah, I bet that 22% has gone up significantly over the last 15 years since they noticed that in 2008. So, again, back to what I was saying, a little bunny trail there, but back to what I was saying, we start looking for studies. Linoleic acid is what you're looking for, or a phrase called oxalams. You'll see OXLAMS, oxalams. That's oxidized linoleic acid metabolite. You'll see that mentioned, or oxidized linoleic acid. And then when you start searching for those terms, then you'll find its correlation with disease pops up much more often. So the term you use matters because of, again, the narrative to push the polyunsaturated fats. Now, again, these oils are basically in all processed foods, with the exception of maybe a few, like small handful number of specialty health brands that might use avocado or coconut oil in the foods they make. But by and large, you start flipping the labels. You got to read the labels. Pick up a process, something in a box, a bag, or a bottle, package of some sort. Got more than one ingredient. Read it. These oils are in there. Even bread, which is something as simple as bread, is going to have these oils in there. They're pervasive. So start reading your labels, becoming aware of the foods that are in high concentrations of these oils. And as you start eliminating them, you'll find you really have to just go with a whole food diet, with rare exception. And again, these are used in pretty much all restaurants as well. You'd be hard pressed to find a restaurant. It'd have to be a pretty nice restaurant that would be willing to cook some of your food at your request, because it's certainly not standard, with butter or olive oil. You can ask, you can try to say, I know people say, hey, I have an allergic reaction to X oil, but they probably like soybean oil, canola oil. Could you cook my food in olive oil or butter? You'd have to be that direct and see what their response is. Not too many restaurants are willing to do that. You can always try, and the more we ask, maybe the more it'll catch on, and more restaurants will start to concede, participate. But it's really just too expensive for them to do on a large scale basis. Those butter and olive oil are just too expensive, so they use these oils are so much cheaper. But I think we also need to be open to the possibility that these oils that have increased the concentration of linoleic acid in our bodies have made us more vulnerable to metabolic disease. Not a stretch considering the correlation with obesity, type 2 diabetes, and heart disease. So yes, our quality of carbohydrates has changed over the last 120 years or so too, right? We're having more sugar, more processed grains, as opposed to whole food carbs like potatoes, or whole grains like rice, or even a homemade bread where they might soak or ferment a traditional wheat, not like the wheat we have now, but a traditional wheat, and it'd be a real hearty, higher fiber, homemade kind of bread without a bunch of additives in it. And remember, our current bread also has these processed oils, which bread in the 1800s wouldn't have had that. So yes, we're having more sugar, more processed grains, the grains we're having. Quality of carbs has decreased. But again, thinking back to these correlations and what the studies show on just the effect of the linoleic acid on insulin resistance, obesity, arterial plaque, mitochondrial dysfunction, fatty liver disease, think more attention needs to be brought to the health risks of these highly inflammatory oils and realize maybe we are more vulnerable to these lower quality carbs like the processed sugar, processed grains. Not saying they're okay, not saying we'd be okay or it'd be healthy eating them, but maybe these oils have contributed to our vulnerability to the highly processed grains. We're reacting even to a greater level. We're having even more disease driven by the processed grains and the sugars because of our oils, because these oils have made us more vulnerable through mitochondrial dysfunction and insulin resistance and the inability to deal with the higher amounts or the more easily processed, easily digested sugars. So just a hypothesis. Again, I'm not vindicating highly processed carbs and sugars, just saying maybe we have had a greater negative response to those processed carbs and sugars because of these oils in our food system. And as we can start eliminating these oils, we might find maybe we can tolerate some carb once we're metabolically healthy, but it's also going to be much easier to get, if you already have metabolic disease, much easier to get healthy and reverse metabolic disease by reducing these oils at the very least, right? So, and again, this is why, it's so important. This is why it's such a focus of the Healthy AF Club is reducing seed oils and finding alternatives and alarming people to the dangers and health risks from these oils. So for home cooking, which I recommend you do the majority of the time just to avoid encountering these oils, highly recommend using tallow, butter, coconut oil, and even lard for everyday cooking. Even bacon drippings are so much better than these seed oils. And of course, they taste better too, right? Now, if you want that olive oil flavor, I get it. For certain things, you just want something that tastes, you're making a certain dish, you want that something that tastes like the olive oil. Try to keep the heat to a low, medium, just to limit oxidation, right? Because there is a certain, there's like 9 to 11% of it is polyunsaturated fat, is omega-6. Or maybe mix the olive oil with a more saturated fat like lard or butter or tallow to get a little bit of the olive oil flavor, but to balance out the amount of saturated fat and reduce the concentration of linoleic acid. So, a happy medium. But it's up to you. Choose your own risk, but understand the more you can reduce these oils, they're already probably in your system because of we all had a lifetime of eating. So, and it can take, I've heard estimated 2 to 3 years, 2 years, I think the half-life in our body of 2 years to reduce. So if we're at 22%, it could take approximately 2 years to get that 22% down to 11%. So it could easily take 2 to 3, maybe even 4 years to get us down to a more moderate to healthy level of linoleic acid in our tissues if we eliminate them completely, let our bodies purge what's already stored. That's a long time to reduce these oils before you really start seeing some changes, right? So if you're not sure about at least to get to a healthier level, right? Where it could take some people that long to see changes. Some might see it a little sooner, but 2 years, a half-life of 2 years is nothing to take lightly. And so to me, it creates a sense of urgency to really go through your pantry, to go through your fridge, to be much more careful about what you're eating, to start cooking with these fats that are much lower at the 2, 3, 9% tops percentage of concentration of linoleic acid, so that our bodies can get back down to our normal healthy level and just reduce the risk of disease. But if you're not sure about the linoleic concentration of a fat, easily searched, right? Search linoleic acid concentration. But generally, any nut or seed-based oil like almond oil, sesame oil is going to be high in linoleic acid. And if it's over, say, 15 to 20%, I'd look for an alternative myself. So it's safest just to stick to traditional fat that I mentioned earlier. And again, they just taste so much better too.